morning we're coming to the 2 centuries now that fill in the gap between the end of the Crusades and the beginning of the Reformation. It is certainly a transitional time. And I have been struggling once again, as I've struggled many times through this whole series, to figure out how to just find the basal themes that will give us some handles to grab onto to make sense out of what are otherwise highly complicated movements and interrelationships of various forces and factions within the history of the European history and world history. And so I'm trying to do that, but I hope you realize that at best we are being somewhat highly selective in terms of the particular things we're pulling out. But these 2 centuries do represent a very important bridge. And what I'd like to do is highlight what I think are at least 3 pieces of the story that more or less represent overlays, if I could use that metaphor. There is one piece of it will be the decline of the power of the Pope. That's really conspicuously probably one of the most remarkable aspects of this time. At the same time, a collateral rise in the power of the nation states that eventually will become the nations of Europe and are already sort of taking on that kind of shape and form. And then thirdly, mixed into the story and giving it a great deal of color and life is that historical phenomenon that we call the Renaissance. And so I want to touch on that. Each of those, you realize, is worth much more time than any that we'll be giving it this morning. But then the final little piece of our story this morning, I'd like to focus in on one of the most remarkable figures during the Renaissance, kind of an anti-Renaissance character, whose name is Savonarola there in Florence. So I hope that that little package of information this morning will give us some food for thought. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, we are deeply grateful again for the great privilege that's ours of reflecting upon the work that you've done through history, for the way that you've used your people to accomplish purposes that are vastly beyond anything they could have done under their own strength. And we find in that the great encouragement that even we can be used similarly to accomplish those things to which you've called us. We commit our time together now in the name of Christ, asking your blessing upon us. Amen. So first of all, let's just take these 3 items that I just mentioned, the first of which has to do with the, as I've said, decline or loss of papal authority. I've tried to highlight this at times past, and let me just say it one more time, that when Rome fell back in the roughly 500, it was really the church that stepped in and performed a great service. I don't sound much like a Protestant at this point, but I have deep gratitude to the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope and the entire infrastructure of the church that really became, earned the name Holy Mother Church. It became, as it were, a mother to Western society and Western civilization. And while it was far from perfect, and I don't think even the most ardent Roman Catholic would say it was perfect, nevertheless, there was a great service, a great social help that was provided during those years. Unfortunately, of course, what we find is that as the power of the church increased, so her moral character declined. And so by the time we reach the end of the medieval period, and certainly going into the time of the Crusades and so on, there are some deep fault lines that are running through the hierarchy of the church and the organization of the church. Certainly bright lights. We saw Bernard, we saw Francis and Aquinas and many others that really stand out as champions of Christian virtue and teaching and so on. Nevertheless, you'd have to say the actual structure of the church was beginning to show some significant problems, and the underpinnings were really being greatly impaired, at least at the point of the purity of doctrine and the moral integrity of the church. And that really brings us then to the period of time that we're at right now. In many ways, the Crusades tended to undermine, once again, the authority and even the moral high ground that had been enjoyed by the church. And all of this comes, as it were, to a head now as we reach the year roughly 1300. We're covering the period of time from 1300 to roughly 1500, or to be more precise, 1294 to 1517. 1294 is when Boniface VIII comes to the throne. 1517 is when Luther tacks the 95 Theses up on the door of the church of Wittenberg. The reason Boniface VIII is important is because he really represents the transitional figure at which time you would say the Pope falls under the dominion of the power of France. There had been an ongoing struggle here, political struggles that I'm not going to take time to detail, but the long and short of it is that this particular struggle between Boniface on the one hand and Philip of France on the other wound up in France winning and Philip winning, and he was able to maneuver a new election, a new Pope, and the Pope was decidedly French, and one of the first things that this French Pope announced was that the home of the papacy was going to move. It had been in Rome now for 1,300 years or 1,200 years or so. Now it was going to be shifted to Avignon. Now Avignon is not in France, but it was considered to be under the complete dominion of French authority and French political influence. And so this began a period of time in which actually the Roman Church was centered in Avignon, and that period lasted for about 70 years. And it came to be called in history the Babylonian captivity of the Pope, or of the papacy. The reason, of course, for that name, the Babylonian captivity, is because it answers to that similar event in the Old Testament where the children of Israel were hauled out of Israel by Nebuchadnezzar for 70 years. And here, remarkably, the Pope is out of town, as it were, for 70 years over in Avignon. And all of this led to a huge loss of credibility in the perception of the world of the independence of the Pope, because now, as it were, the Pope was really in the back seat of the car, driven by the King of France. And so this really had a breathtaking impact on the way in which the papacy was viewed. During that 70 years, it was also pretty obvious that the moral performance of the Pope and the Church was greatly diminished, but at the same time, the wealth of the Church was being built up dramatically, especially under John the 22nd. But the 70 years really did not do the Church any good in terms of the way that she was perceived. Finally, in the year 1378, which is exactly 69 years after this beginning of the Babylonian captivity, as it was called, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, went to Rome, more or less disgusted with the way things had been handled in the church, and was able to convene a new council of the church, at which time a new pope was elected, a so-called anti-pope. And so in 1378, there were two popes. There was the Pope in Avignon, and now another Pope in Rome. And these two popes each claimed to be the legitimate pope. Well, this then began a new period of time after the 70 years, which was the time so-called of the papal schism, another 50 years, in which you have at times two and at times three different popes, all claiming to be the true and legitimate Pope of Rome. Now again, you can imagine, from the point of view of the average person, this looks ridiculous. And again, the overall perception of the church was just plummeting in terms of her credibility to have that kind of war going on. There were some attempts then to try to piece back together the gap among these various factions, and so this gave rise to several different councils of the church. These were called reformatory councils, in which there was some effort to try to heal the breach. The first of these took place in 1409. It was the Council of Pisa, and actually that was where the third pope was elected. So now you've got the two, Avignon, Rome, and now the Pisan pope comes on the scene claiming to be the proper pope of the church. That didn't work. The next council was the Council of Constance. This took place in 1414. This council lasted for about 5 years, and once again represented an attempt to try to heal the breach. Fortunately, they didn't come up with a fourth pope at that point. Still 3, but there were various attempts to try to politically work out the problem. It largely failed. The Council of Constance is important for us as well because this was also the council where a certain heretic was brought to trial and condemned and burned at the stake, whose name was John Huss. And I want to return to a discussion of John Huss 2 weeks from today. In fact, 2 weeks from today, we're going to cover John Wycliffe and John Huss, their 2 lives in one presentation, and that will lead us up then to the time of the Reformation. The final of these reformatory councils that took place is the Council of Basel. This was in 1431. This one finally, or at least the effects of that, finally did bring now back into the leadership of the church one pope. But for about 50 years, you've got this kind of thing going on. And so you can imagine the kind of confusion that created. But more importantly, what it did was it established a kind of expectation in Europe that it's okay to raise these questions about the legitimacy of any particular pope, and even the papacy itself kind of came under the conversation to some degree. Europe became a bit of a platform for discussion, something that had never happened before. Holy Mother Church had really owned the game, but now you see at this point it's okay to raise these questions, and these councils gave permission, as it were, for that kind of free debate about the authority of the church. 1460 to 1517, there is no recovery by the church of the moral high ground. It really is lost irrevocably at that point, not to be regained really until the Council of Trent, which is well after the Reformation has gotten underway. It just continues to spiral downward, and that in some ways is why the Reformation could happen. In some ways it was because of the vacuum spiritually and morally that was occurring in the church that the Reformation became, as it were, a spark in a powder keg, as we are going to see. Along with the reformatory councils, there were other movements that were raising questions about the Pope and the papacy in general that again were more or less undermining its power and authority. One of these was the rapid rise of the distribution of literature. The printing press, Gutenberg's press, was invented in 1440, but already there was a great deal of literature being circulated. In some ways, you know that necessity is the mother of invention. It was the very fact that there was so much need for a way to distribute literature that sort of drove a guy like Gutenberg to come up with his invention. And again, it's been pointed out many times that the Reformation couldn't have happened but for the technological advance that was created by the Gutenberg press. Other forms of literature, of course, were distributed widely. It was during this time, by the way, that the common law began to really take shape as something that was over against canon law within the church. We, of course, as Americans are in the common law tradition that goes back through England and Western history, and so we have a great deal of interest in the common law. And it was really during this time, again, that the common law could begin to take shape. Poetry, particularly the epic poem by Dante, the Divine Comedy, had a huge influence during this period of time. You know that it takes place in 3 great movements in which Dante is touring, as it were. First of all, the Inferno, hell, followed by Purgatorio, and then finally Paradiso, heaven. And Purgatory and hell and heaven, the 3 places that he visits. But one of the things that's interesting, of course, is as he's visiting the Inferno, and the deepest, darkest, hottest, most intensely severe place in the Inferno, he happens to spot there in the fires of hell no one less than several of the most famous popes, you see. And that, again, was very widely distributed and had some effect. And that was the kind of thing you begin to see going on. Another famous figure of the time was William of Ockham. Ockham was a great nominalist who, if you're familiar with the philosophical nomenclature there, is one who was hostile to Platonic philosophy, which was really what the church had been adopting all through the Middle Ages. and Occam was critical of the church on those philosophical bases. Luther was heavily influenced by Occam. He was not an Occamite, as they were called. He didn't follow him, but the very freedom, once again, that came through his writings to criticize and raise questions about the legitimacy of various institutions was very important. So anyway, that's one piece of the puzzle. As you can tell, all of these things were, in a sense, causing the credibility of the Pope to gradually and rather precipitously decline, while at the same time, the Crusades had begun something, more or less unwittingly. An unexpected effect of the Crusades had been to arouse a new kind of nationalism in Europe. One would have thought the Pope would have gained power through the Crusades, because in many ways the Pope was the great cheerleader for the Crusades. But what actually happened was just the opposite. That as the princes began to rally their forces, what it tended to do was create a national spirit. You had not only the nobility, but commoners sort of joining arms in a common quest to go do something, and while it was all on behalf of the church, in a sense these people began to have a kind of loyalty to each other. The English with the English, the French with the French, that kind of thing. So that by the time the Crusades were over, a sense of national identity had become much more a part of the culture of Europe than had been the case theretofore. And so kind of like a seesaw, you've got the papal authority going down while this nationalism and so on is rising. And then mixed into the discussion, the third little piece that I'm going to just inadequate in treating is, of course, the Renaissance. But what can we say about the Renaissance in terms of our story of the unfolding life of the church? Several areas, I think, can be identified as points where we see the influence and effects of the Renaissance. One would be what I just call society generally. The Renaissance gives us a bridge from feudalism on the one hand to nationalism on the other. And I've already talked a little bit about that. I won't mention it further. Separately, the whole phenomenon of language is, by way of the Renaissance, changed. In the medieval period, there was one holy language. It was Latin. The Bible was in Latin. Worship was in Latin. Everything was Latin. Many of the people couldn't speak Latin, and so they just assumed that something good was happening. They didn't know what, but they knew they needed to be there and hear it in Latin. And so that was kind of it, the holy language of the holy life of the holy church, more or less other from the ordinary person's grasp or reach. But the Renaissance gives life back to the person on the street. And so there's a change from the holy language to the street language. And in the Renaissance, you really find a new interest in the languages of the people. English, French, German as having a legitimate kind of mode and vehicle of expression in and of themselves. In terms of thought, you have a movement from dogmatism to what I call criticism. In the medieval period, in the Middle Ages, what the church said was accepted dogmatically. Even Thomas Aquinas, as much as I love him, I have to say, was not prepared to think outside the box, you see. What the Pope said became gospel truth. Thomas's task was to defend it, and he did defend it brilliantly. Although I think sometimes what he was defending was indefensible. But if anybody could do it, he could do it, you see. And so it's a remarkable thing to see how well he was gifted in that area. But what happens through the Renaissance is people start thinking outside the box. Are we really prepared to accept in a sort of mindless dogmatism this particular proposition? Let's hold that up to the light now and ask some new questions about it. And that new kind of criticism or critical attitude was one of the benefits and fruits of the Renaissance. In metaphysics, you've got a shift from transcendence to immanence, and in all aspects of life, but especially religiously. You know that the architecture of the Middle Ages, the Gothic architecture, was characterized by the great spire that would call your eye to transcendent truth. The art was Byzantine. You looked at it and it looked strange. These were not real world figures. All of the portraiture and painting and so on of that kind of Gothic, Byzantine, medieval sort of expression, it's not because those people didn't know how to do art. This was intentional. This was to say that the most important things are otherworldly, not here, transcendent, not immanent. And of course the Renaissance gives us a huge dramatic shift of interest back to this world. The architecture of choice ceased to be the great spire and became the dome. Artistically, the spire calls your eye upward. The dome calls your eye to the center of the circle. You see, and the dome is a half circle calling your attention to this world. And the art begins to become much more real. Figures. The Mona Lisa looks like an ordinary, lovely woman. She doesn't look like some strange, distorted woman that you would get from the Byzantine picture. All of this is simply a way of saying that artistically, literarily, in all of these ways, the attention begins to come back, of course, to life on this planet. Personhood, you've got to shift from what you might call the collectivism of the medieval area to more of an individualism that characterized a later time. When Martin Luther stood up at the Diet of Worms and said to the church that was gathered there, unless I am convinced by sacred scripture or evident reason, he was saying something that was strikingly unprecedented until the Renaissance. Until the Renaissance created the possibility of asking the question, what am I convinced of? That was part of the shift, of course, that we have all through this period. The vehicles of the Renaissance, I probably don't need to tell you. We think of things like art, of course, which came in various forms. I've already mentioned architecture. Sculpture, of course, the story of Michelangelo comes to mind because, again, he represents this new, revived interest in what is truly human. You know, when he did sculpting, he wanted to sculpt the human figure as it really is. He would sneak into the counterpart to a mortuary in his day and actually dissect bodies. He had to see what's inside here, what gives it its form, and it was the musculature of the human body and so on as it really is. You don't see that. You look at the sculpting of an earlier period. There's no concern about this actually reflecting the true form of the human body. But Michelangelo, the Renaissance person, wants to know what is truly human. That sort of thing is going on. Of course, in painting, you think of Raphael, you think of Leonardo, Da Vinci, and others. In science, it's Roger Bacon who really kind of pushes the door open, asking questions about the study of the natural order of things and already beginning to sort of demystify nature in some way or other. Columbus, toward the end of this period, is raising questions about the whole nature of how we understand geography and so on. In astronomy, it's Copernicus who's reforming our whole view of the universe and that whole thing. In literature, of course, I mentioned Dante. The church had long discouraged the studies of the classics. That was considered to be off limits, not good for the development of the spiritual life. And so there was a great threat that was mounted when the Arabs, and particularly the Islamic religion, began to study the classics and use the classics in the service of their own religion, and particularly Aristotle and others became great weapons that were being used. This was, of course, what led to the commissioning of Thomas Aquinas to become a student of Aristotle. But Thomas kind of opened the door to a new interest not only in Aristotle, but all of the classical authors, not just Thomas, but of course the whole spirit of the age kind of pushed open the windows to take a new look at the classical literature. And so part of what happens in the Renaissance is an entire recovery and rebirth, as it were, of interest in classical learning as itself, not specifically Christian, but the study of Cicero, the study of Seneca, the study of Tacitus, the study of Euripides, and all of these great ancient sources of history and thought and philosophy and so on became very important. And of course, the new genre of literature was really a reflection of some of the style and form that came from the classic literature as well. The limits that we'd have to attach to the Renaissance would be this. While it did represent a great rebirth of the human spirit, it did not necessarily represent a rebirth of the religious spirit. And so it was decidedly a secularizing movement. It really took the Reformation to take the next step and ask the questions about the revival and renewal of a true heart of worship, as we would think happened through much of what was in the Reformation. I'd like to briefly read to you a quick descriptive paragraph about the Renaissance. I'm taking this from the church historian Philip Schaff. I think he summarized it much better than I can, so if you don't mind, let me just give this to you and we'll conclude this little piece of our discussion. He says, quote, "It was then the mission of the Renaissance to start the spirit of free inquiry, to certify to the mind its dignity, to expand the horizons to the faculties of man as a citizen of the world, to recover from the dust of ages the literary treasures and monuments of ancient Greece and Rome, to inaugurate a style of fresh description based on observation in opposition to the dialectic circumlocution of scholastic philosophy, to call forth the laity and to direct attention to the value of natural morality and the natural relationships of man with man. To the monk, beauty was a snare, woman a temptation, pleasure a sin, the world vanity of vanities. The humanist taught that the present life is worth living. The Renaissance breathed a cosmopolitan spirit and fostered universal sympathies. In the spirit of some of the yearnings of the later Roman authors, Dante exclaimed again, quote, "My home is the world," close quote, close quote. So that statement, I think, from Schaff is a good summary of the Renaissance. Of course, the heart of the Renaissance, geographically speaking, was Florence. Florence is the place where, you might say, the beating heart of the Renaissance took place. It was from Florence that you have Dante, Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, Michelangelo. All of them were located there in Florence, and you have to say that was the flowering locus of it. But that brings us then to the final little piece of our discussion this morning. I'd like to shift to the great figure who, like a flash of lightning, changed Florence for a time and stands out as one of the most remarkable figures, probably to us Protestants not as well known as he ought to be, but the figure that really is worth studying. And his name was Girolamo Savonarola. He did most of his work there in Florence in the last decade of the 1400s. And so it's that period of time in particular that we want to consider. He was the prior of the convent of St. Mark in Florence. If you've been to Florence, you know that that remarkable cathedral there of St. Mark is one of its most important edifices. Savonarola was the most imposing preacher by far of that period of time, the late Renaissance leading up to the Reformation. He was a preacher not in the genre of Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a man who really lifted up the mystical life of searching for Christ in the inner spiritual quest, and had a lot to say about God's grace and receiving us and so on. Listening to Savonarola was sort of like listening to that which would reduce you to a grease spot. You know, he was the kind of preacher that just was like listening or hearing a bolt of lightning or a clap of thunder. That was the style of Savonarola. He was a Dominican monk. He became a Dominican at the age of 23, more or less lamenting the condition and the moral state of Europe at that time. Not at all pleased with the movement of the Renaissance. He felt that this movement away from a life of true worship was worthy of the most severe criticism. And so we have to look at Savonarola not as a Renaissance figure, but an anti-Renaissance figure, as I've indicated to you. He was a deep student of Augustine, of Thomas Aquinas, but more than any of those, he was a deep student of the Scriptures. And to this day, you can see in a museum in Florence his Bible. And there are all kinds of detailed marginal notes in his own handwriting where he obviously would reflect on what the Scriptures were saying and record his own thoughts there on his Bible as well. He not only studied Bible in Latin, which was more or less the standard text, but also deeply studied it in Hebrew and Greek. And so he's not to be just simply dismissed as a flaming personality. He was a serious student of the Bible and of things Christian and so on. He arrived the first time in Florence in 1481, and at that time he came in only for a brief stay. St. Mark's had just been rebuilt by Cosimo de' Medici, who was the father to Lorenzo, who's the famous figure that we'll look at in a moment. But this was really a time, 1481, when Florence was at the very height of her fame as the center of the Renaissance spirit. And so he arrived at that time. The city was, in Savonarola's view, given over to the kind of light-hearted dissipation of Lorenzo the Great. Lorenzo de' Medici, the great patron of the Renaissance, the great supporter of many of the artists and so on of the Renaissance, but a man who had, in Savonarola's view, usurped the freedom to some degree of the Florentines. Savonarola arrived for the first time in 1481. He preached briefly. His crowds immediately descended from several hundred to about 25. So there was not a successful preaching venture, and he left more or less feeling that this was a lost cause. He returned, however, to Florence in 1486, at which time he preached a series of sermons on the book of Revelation. Now, the book of Revelation gives you an awful lot of room, a lot of things to work with, and especially in terms of themes of judgment. And so he drew freely from the images and the graphic language of Revelation in order to proclaim and predict huge judgment that was going to fall on Europe and especially on Florence because of her ungodly abandonment of things holy and things sacred and her immoralities and dissipation and so on. Well, he had some success in that. In other words, he did impact the city rather dramatically at that time. Again, he left, and again he was invited back, this time in 1489, this time by no one less than Lorenzo de' Medici himself, although Lorenzo didn't like Savonarola very much because he had been personally the target of a fair amount of Savonarola's preaching. But at the urging of Pico, who you know is a Renaissance figure, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola is his name, and he was one of the great figures of the Renaissance. He liked Savonarola. He prevailed upon Lorenzo to invite him back once again. And so against Lorenzo's better judgment, he invited Savonarola back to Florence. He came back in 1490 and lived there until 1498, which was the date of his death at a rather young age, as we'll see in a moment. Well, at that time, he began to preach, and he preached in earnest. His sermons were something like, as I say, flashes of lightning. There was a little bit of mercy, a little bit of grace in these sermons, but for the most part, they were great, sweeping pronouncements of impending doom. And yet people flocked to his sermons, crowds which by those standards were huge. 12 to 14,000 people or more would gather to hear him preach in the open air, and they were deeply moved. There were reports of people weeping, convulsing under the sense of repentance and remorse over the lives they were living. He was an equal opportunity critic of everybody. He not only targeted the people who were at the lower echelons of society, but had no problem pulling out the guns against clergy, against priests, prelates, and political leaders, including Lorenzo himself, was treated frequently to being named by name as a target of his critique. And yet at the same time, you could never say of Savonarola that he was a man void of love or compassion. He loved Florence. He was a Florentine. He would frequently in his sermons call Florence my Florence. He was part and parcel of that community. You have to identify him with Florence as much as you identify Luther with Wittenberg or Calvin with Geneva. But nevertheless, his sermons were great, powerful displays. Just to try to illustrate this, I borrowed one little excerpt from one sermon. I cannot do this justice in terms of its presentation, but I hope you'll at least get a flavor in the language here of the style of his preaching. So this would be from Savonarola, one of his sermons. Quote, "In these days, prelates and preachers are chained to the earth by the love of earthly things. Their care of souls is no longer their concern. They are content with the receipt of revenue. The preachers preach to please the princes and to be praised by them. They've done worse. They've not only destroyed the church of God, they've built up a new church after their own pattern. Go to Rome and see. In the mansions of the great prelates there is no concern save for poetry and the oratorical art. Go thither and see, and thou shalt find them all with books of the humanities in their hands, and telling one another that they can guide men's souls by means of Virgil, Horace, and Cicero. The prelates of former days had fewer gold mitres and chalices, and what few they possessed were broken up and given to relieve the needs of the poor. But our prelates, for the sake of obtaining chalices, will rob the poor of their sole means of support. Dost thou not know what I would tell thee? What doest thou, O Lord? Arise and come to deliver thy church from the hands of devils, and from the hands of tyrants, and from the hands of iniquitous priests." There you are. So Savonarola, and you can imagine just hearing about a 2-hour barrage of that kind of preaching, and it might reduce everybody to their knees. On one occasion, Savonarola claimed to have seen a great vision of a sword suspended over the city of Florence. This was in 1492, which is a date you might otherwise recognize, but in this case we're concerned that this was the time when Florence, in the eye of Savonarola, had this great sword suspended over it, and it was inscribed with the following words, quote, "Behold, the sword of the Lord will descend suddenly and quickly upon the earth." And Savonarola really believed that that was a vision given to him by God. As he saw it, it turned, the heavens quaked, and he felt that Europe in general and Florence in particular were going to be treated to huge cataclysmic catastrophe at the hands of God. He referred to that vision frequently in years to come, while at the same time presenting himself to the Florentines as a prophet. I don't know if that vision of the sword actually came from God. I certainly wouldn't deny it, but I would say this: it was a great metaphor for the preaching of Savonarola himself. One person who was there described his preaching as, quote, "impulsive, pictorial, eruptive, startling, not judicial, and instructive." This was not the kind of place where you went for didactic sermons, scholarly treatises. No. This was, Pico on one occasion said, he felt a cold shudder course through him, and his hair, as it were, stand on end, as he heard the preaching of Savonarola. All through Savonarola's sermons, the biblical element was certainly present, although I think any fair reader of his sermons would say that his exegesis was defective at best. I mean, he freely drew from images in the Bible to draw immediate applications of certain images and so on to his particular setting. He liked to preach from Haggai, he liked Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, but far and away his favorite book was Revelation. He did insist on the exclusive authority of the Scriptures. And in that respect, while he was a true Roman Catholic, he adopted and believed the Roman Catholic theology by and large. We wouldn't call him a pre-Reformation reformer in that sense. He didn't really lead us to Luther, as did Wycliffe or Huss. But at this point, he would be very comfortable with Luther's sola scriptura, because once again, Savonarola had a deep conviction of the sole authority of the Scriptures. There was an occasion that's rather interesting at the time of the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, which was about 1495. Lorenzo knew he was on his deathbed. He knew that his days were numbered, and he wanted to make sure that he had adequately confessed his sin before his demise. He certainly could have called anybody, any priest. He probably could have called the Pope himself. Lorenzo was that important and that had that much authority in that day. But it's interesting that Lorenzo called the man who had been his chief enemy in Florence to hear his confession. So he called for Savonarola to come and be his priest confessor at the end of his life. He was reported to have said at that time, quote, "I know of no honest friar save this one." And so he summoned Savonarola, who was glad to come and hear the final confession of Lorenzo de' Medici. He confessed 3 particular sins, which all had to do with political exploits of Lorenzo, for which he was feeling some compunction now toward the end of his life. Savonarola told him he could be forgiven if he met 3 conditions. The first of the conditions was that he had strong faith in God's mercy, to which Lorenzo gave his consent. The second condition was that he restore ill-gotten wealth or charge his sons to do it after his death, to which Lorenzo gave reluctant consent. Third, that he give back to the Florentines their liberties. At that third request, Lorenzo de' Medici was reported to have turned his face to the wall and wept. But we don't have any indication that he actually was prepared to give instructions that there would be a restoration of the liberties in Florence. After Lorenzo's death, and in fulfillment of something that Savonarola had predicted, the King of France, who was Charles VIII, brought a great army against Florence, this was something that had been dramatically predicted by Savonarola at a time when it didn't seem highly likely. And this gave great credibility to him that he had actually predicted something years earlier that now was happening. And the army of France came, and Savonarola himself actually went out and negotiated with Charles VIII, telling him that he was actually the emissary of God's judgment, playing a role not unlike Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament. Charles VIII was very impressed. And in fact, the result of that was that he essentially restored to Florence the liberties that had been deprived of them from the de Medici family. The de Medicis were run out of town, and Florence did become, at that point, something of a kind of theocracy for a few years under the moral leadership of Savonarola, but he was no political leader. He wasn't. He had no political status whatsoever. In that position, he continued to preach. His sermons became increasingly intense in condemning the church and the immoralities of the church, and in particular, the Pope. Until finally the Pope had really had it up to here, you know what I mean, with Savonarola, and pronounced him as a heretic and calls on him to repent. And that only raised the volume for Savonarola. He wasn't about to repent of anything, and so he just became all the more intense and formidable in his preaching. At this point, the Pope thought, well, I take this to be a kind of, if you can't beat him, join him kind of strategy. The Pope actually offered to make Savonarola a cardinal, which would be second behind the Pope himself, and Savonarola had no interest in being a cardinal, so that just raised it all the more. And so the Pope finally, in frustration, put the city of Florence under interdict, which meant that the sacraments of the church no longer were efficacious, that in effect it was like condemning the whole population of the city to hell for the sake of Savonarola. Now, even though the people of Florence very much liked Savonarola, that made them nervous. They had enough confidence in the church that in spite of his preaching, they wondered whether this maybe had gone too far. And so that began to be a time of shifting loyalty and some significant questions about Savonarola and whether or not he was really on the right bead here. And it really became worse and worse over the next year or so until finally a Franciscan monk raised a challenge to Savonarola of what was called the ordeal, which was a medieval kind of trial. The idea was that you would subject yourself to some life-threatening condition, and if God was with you, you would be protected. Otherwise, you would go up in flames. But it's one of those things. And so, how much do you really trust your confidence in God? Well, this put Savonarola in an impossible condition. If he declined the ordeal, then everybody would say, oh, well, the guy's, cuckoo, and we disregard it. But he was not one, he didn't trust the legitimacy of the ordeal either. And so, anyway, but he consented to it. There was actually another person who was prepared to stand in for him, a Dominican monk who was going to actually go through the ordeal on his behalf, which was permitted under medieval, law. The day came, the whole city was gathered. This was a huge deal because, it's like people came from miles around for the event of the ordeal. A great fire was going to be built, and the man who would represent Savonarola was going to pass through this fire. The day came, the hour came, and at the very moment it was supposed to happen, there was a huge thundercloud, and rain came down and put out the fire. So they rebuilt the fire. But then there was some backroom maneuvering and wrangling and political compromise until finally the end of the day came and nothing happened. Savonarola was still alive, his champion was still alive, but the overall impact of this whole thing was to cause a complete loss of confidence in Savonarola. He was, in fact, about 4 weeks later arrested for heresy. He was put on the rack. He was subjected to unspeakable torture, and under that torture, he indeed recanted some of what he had said, particularly things critical of the Pope. As a result of that recantation, he was pronounced guilty and was in fact hung only a few weeks later in Florence, and his body was burned. The Roman Catholic Church viewed him as a very evil person for many years, but in more modern times, his image has been greatly rehabilitated, and today he's generally viewed as a great reformer, a great hero, a great champion.